In the many discussions of the last 2 days, a common element of the theme has been the nature of a transition. It's as if the best that mind could develop has failed, and the need for something greater. And yet at the same time, when mind fails and something greater is not yet available, there is a passage in between where neither the power of the intellect can assist nor the new consciousness which is still developing. In the Indian tradition, it is called the joint sandhi between two yugas, two ages, two cycles of development. Sri Aurobindo, in a prophetic passage in Savitri, describes this as an image unfolding, which Ashwapati sees, and it is revealed to him. The unfolding image showed the things to come. A giant dance of Shiva tore the past. There was a thunder as of worlds that fall. Earth was overrun with fire and the roar of death, clamoring to slay a world his hunger had made. There was a clangor of destruction's wings. The Titan's battle cry was in my ears. Alarm and rumor shook the armored night. Now, in this description, you see this massive destruction of the past. And it is so massive, it's as if worlds collapsing. A thunder as of worlds that fall. Doesn't mean the world has been destroyed, but it's the collapse of an entire civilizational phase. And not just of a small cycle, of a gigantic cycle. And so the collapse is resounding. Clangor of destruction's wings, Titan's battle cry, alarm and rumor. And throughout, where is this happening? In the armored night. Because it's the period of darkness of the Kali Yuga that is ending. And in the midst of this, at the same time, something else that is emerging. I saw the omnipotent's flaming pioneers over the heavenly verge which turns towards life, come crowding down the amber stairs of birth. The flaming pioneers rushing down. They're not coming in singles, they're coming in groups. Crowding down. Forerunners of a divine multitude. Out of the paths of the morning star they came, into the little room of mortal life. They are not the divine multitude itself. They are forerunners. They're going to prepare for it. And so he's very careful in his choice of words. It's not as if suddenly, wonderfully, everything becomes magically divine. There is a period, there is a transition, there is an effort, there is a struggle, there are stages. Out of the paths of the morning star. You know what is the morning star? Venus. And why is it called the morning star? It's a planet which is close enough to the sun that you will never see it too far in the sky. And when the sun is setting, Venus is perhaps, if it's on the other side, it's the last before the sun sets that you can see. And after that, with the sun, Venus also goes away. But when the sun is rising, just before the sun rises, you see Venus emerging. And so when you see Venus, even though it seems like it's dark, you know the sun is just behind. And so that's why it's the morning star. It heralds the morning that is to come. And so it's not yet morning. It's not going to be morning suddenly. But the herald, the signs will be there. It's something interesting also. The nature of Venus and Earth's orbit, the distances from the sun and the speed of the orbital path of these two planets are so coordinated in relation to the sun that if you were to map Venus every morning and just mark a dot, let's say you're looking through a window pane, you mark a dot. Where's Venus today? Mark a dot. Tomorrow you mark a dot. And from the same position, keep marking dots. Over a span of about, I think, 1.5 years, you will see Venus make a pentagram. Perfect pentagram. And it keeps moving like that. Amazing. It's not by chance. There are more such extraordinary coincidences in the relationships between the planets, all of which point to some deep harmony or wisdom, intelligence, which has put all these together. And so, out of the paths of the morning star they came, and they represent that, the beginning of a new age. Into the little room of mortal life, I saw them cross the twilight of an age, one age dying, and another age beginning. In between is this twilight. Not yet full darkness, not yet full light, somewhere in between. The sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn, the great creators with wide brows of calm, the massive barrier breakers of the world, and wrestlers with destiny in her lists of will, the laborers in the quarries of the gods, the messengers of the incommunicable, the architects of immortality. They're all different aspects of the work that has to be done, which they come to prepare. Into the fallen human sphere they came, faces that wore the immortal's glory still, voices that communed still with the thoughts of God, bodies made beautiful by the Spirit's light. Carrying the magic word, the mystic fire, carrying the Dionysian cup of joy, approaching eyes of a diviner man, lips chanting an unknown anthem of the soul, feet echoing in the corridors of time. That their action, their steps, do not have just a superficial impact, but a rippling impact that echoes down. High priests of wisdom, sweetness, might, and bliss. Discoverers of beauty's sunlit ways, and swimmers of love's laughing, fiery floods, and dancers within rapture's golden doors. Their tread one day shall change the suffering earth and justify the light on nature's face. And we have not dwelt in detail on, but you get the sense of it. The nature of a transition of an age, and especially of the nature of this transition, which is unprecedented. There have been many transitions, many ages, many cycles, many yugas, civilizations rising and falling. But the nature of this transition has no precedent because the best that mind can create has also given us powers which are so extraordinary that we have the power to destroy everything, if those powers are held in the hands of the little ego. Meanwhile, as the mind's age collapses, these powers suddenly are thrown out into a chaotic phase. And the light of the new dawn is not yet. We're in the twilight. And this is the most dangerous transition. It's not the first time it has happened in the universe. There have been other planets, other civilizations on other planets which have been through it all. The passage through the end of the age of reason and the beginning of the spiritual age and the in-between chaos. But for Earth, it's the first time. And the dangers here are extraordinary. And it is important to recognize which part represents the declining phase and which part represents the ascending phase, because the two are mixed. Sometimes in the very declining parts are the seeds of the new. But you cannot seize upon the declining part and say, this is therefore the new. The two things are so heavily mixed. And so it's extremely important to recognize what you should cling to and what you should let go of. Sri Aurobindo warns about this. And he says the error that is being made today is precisely to cling to the things of the past which have exhausted their purpose. It worked for us for so many centuries or millennia, and how can we let it go? If we let it go, we will fall into chaos. And so we try to cling to the very things which are breaking down. And we delay their breakdown, or we get pulled into the breakdown itself. On the other hand, the things which are emerging are so subtle sometimes, so new, so different, that we fear them. Or we do not recognize that they represent a positive development because they have not yet come into their own, they have not taken charge or organized their action in the world. One such, which is in between, is the structure of the internet. On the one hand, it uses knowledge of the past, but what it actually brings and represents a development of the future, a peer level of connection of the whole world. And while it allows for free sharing of information, of even knowledge, of a bonding at a deeper level, at the same time the past can seize upon the new tools and attempt to warp them to its purpose, to bind you further, to lock you into a kind of an echo chamber, to spy on you, to deflect your interests and manipulate you. This also happens. These gigantic conglomerates, multinationals which control information on the internet are all built on unsustainable economics. They're all losing money, and yet they continue. And how do you explain it? You don't. Well, they cover it up by saying you are the product. They are selling advertisements, but it's not just that. There's a whole entrenched system which wants to utilize these new tools to manipulate you. Now, if you look at the information which you are putting up on the internet, whether it is Facebook or into your emails, which they now control, they can very easily profile you. They know exactly what you're thinking, they know your mood, they can precisely describe what's happening in your life. And through very subtle tests, they can make out what you respond to, what are your trigger points, and then feed you news which manipulates your trigger points to slant your thought process in a direction that they want. And you're not even conscious of it. You think you're doing it in free choice. And it's done so subtly, so carefully. There's one interesting example. It took place in New York, where a teenage girl received an offer from a conglomerate chain of stores, an offer for baby clothes. And the father was incensed. How is it my teenage daughter, who's not even of age to have a child, is being given promotionals for somebody who would have a child? He tried to sue the company. The company looked at their software and discovered the software was monitoring each of their users, buyers, and it had detected a pattern. She had been buying soaps of a certain brand and clothes of a certain brand, and suddenly she shifted to a different brand which is without strong smells. A pattern which the software recognized as a sign of pregnancy. Anticipating birth of a child 3 months down, it began to promote already the goods for a pregnant mother. In fact, the girl was pregnant. The father didn't know, but the company knew. And it was already slanting her pattern of purchases, anticipating this. It goes so deep. If you actually knew how far AI can predict your behavior, you would be so shocked. It's more accurate than your horoscope, or perhaps as accurate. Because it's monitoring you at each moment, every day. And if you trace back to the beginning of this whole phase, Facebook, for example, was started exactly or registered exactly the same day that DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Programs, shut down their official secret program called LifeLog. It was supposed to be a secret program in which they would document information about every human being on earth for this purpose, to predict their behavior and to manipulate behavior. And they realized that if ever this got out, there would be huge fall back, there would be a huge reaction from people that the government was spying on them. And to get information from people was so much harder. The better way was, let people volunteer the information. So they shut down LifeLog and initiated Facebook exactly the same day. And the entire DARPA team, which was heading LifeLog, left DARPA and joined Facebook as its top leadership. What happened? It suddenly went into private hands. People trusted a private company and offered all their secrets. And every now and then you have Google Maps, Facebook or Gmail asking you, is this interesting? Is that useful? And they monitor your behavior. It's fascinating to see. I've traveled across 10 countries in a span of a few weeks. And wherever I went, ads would pop up which were chasing to identify what age group I belonged to. Whether I had children, whether I had certain illnesses. And it came up with statements which would, they were not always ads, they were articles which will say, if you have diabetes, you must read this. New breakthrough regarding diabetes. And if you click on it, they know you have diabetes. Or at least you're interested in diabetes. If you have a child who's less than 2 years old, this is critical. If you click on it, they know you have a child less than 2 years old. And that's how they're profiling you, through news items and through ads, until they've built up such a complete profile. They know your trigger points, weaknesses and strengths. And then you will see the whole news mechanism was modified to give you news for you, specially designed for you. By who? By the company. For what? To manipulate your thought patterns, your behavior patterns and your purchase patterns. And effectively, each person is surrounded by a complete bubble which is unique to that person, designed to force you into a pattern of behavior. So perfectly orchestrated that you're not conscious. You think you're free. And this is one of the stated objectives by some of these companies. I'm not going too deep into it, but you get the idea. Here's a tool which could set humanity free, allow a free exchange, and this is seized by the old world and warped to its end. And you cannot know the difference. And that's why I'm trying to point out that there are two things happening and the two are heavily mixed. And we need to distinguish what we should catch, what we should let go. And the internet is a great and powerful tool. It should be grown, it should be encouraged, but it should be liberated from these centralized controls. But how do you do that? You cannot. It's not even in your hands. But at the very least, you can become conscious. But look at bigger picture of other things. Trends which, going back the last few decades, point to something which is alarming, dangerous perhaps. Look at the trends in music, the trends in cinema, the trends in all kinds of entertainment and public consumption of the entertainment. You find over the last 30 years decline in standards, becoming more and more coarse, crude, dark, elements of perversion introduced in a way as to normalize them. And initially there's a reaction. After a few years you get used to it. Well, society is like that. What can we do? And then you are told how to justify it to yourself so you don't feel bad. It's the young people, they want it. And all the old people say, yeah, we don't understand why they want it. But the young people are told that's what you want. And they say, oh yeah, that's what we want. No, we don't. Given a choice, a newborn baby, if he's shown something beautiful and something ugly, he will choose the beautiful thing. But if he's exposed to the ugly and made to think that this is normal, when the beautiful thing comes, he says, that's not interesting, this is so much more provocative. If in listening to music, you're dished out something which is harsh and coarse repeatedly for hours every day, you lose the sensitivity for finer things. And then you need the harsh stimulation to feel something. And we've seen among children the way it warps their behavior. So here's an example of a child known to me in a family we knew in India. She was very studious, very concentrated. She moved to London for a university program, and a couple of months down, her grades began to fall, her concentration was falling, and the parents brought her to me once they were visiting, and they said, please tell her how to develop her power of concentration. Well, they expected a preachings, and the girl was already shut down. She had heard these stories many times. You should concentrate, you should make effort. So I tried to sense what it was, and I asked her, do you listen to music? Oh yes. How often? All the time. I have these things plugged in. What do you listen to? And she describes what she listened to. And I said, there's your problem of concentration. You're listening to something plugged into your ears for 4 to 5 hours a day. And it has music which goes jing jang, jing jang, jing jang, jing jang, jing jang. What happens to your nerves after a while? It goes jing jang, jing jang, jing jang. And what happens to your walk? Interestingly, if you watch someone who's listening to that music, the walk goes like that. And the heart pace increases to match the pace of the music. Try this as an example. Get a beat that goes more than 80 times per second and try to relax in it. You can't. Your heart pace matches the beat. And it's higher than average 72 or whatever it would be. And it excites you. It holds you in a state of excitement and attention, but the body is tired. It's tired, it wants to relax, but it can't. Your brain waves synchronize to the beat of the music and more subtle suggestions in the beat. And they are designed to push you into a state of mild hypnosis. And so here's one pattern which fits, which influences your brain to mild hypnosis, another pattern which excites your nerves, and then the words. Now listen to the words of the music they're listening to. And pay attention to what they're listening to. As adults, as parents, you say, oh, this is the fashion nowadays, this is the in thing. You don't bother, you don't care. But if you actually heard the music, I'm already a little outdated, I don't know the latest patterns, but going back 20 years, there used to be these rock bands which had been made popular, Antichrist, Devil's Child, AC/DC. Now, the children didn't say Antichrist, Devil's Child because the parents would get alarmed. It was AC/DC. I'm listening to AC/DC. Oh yeah, what's that? Oh, it's just a new rock band. And each of these, strangely enough, and the very popular projected icons, had statements in the public which sounded so weird. They would speak of worshipping the devil, they would speak of Satanism, they would speak of all kinds of strange, deliberate perversions of values as their fashionable style of living. Some of them exhibited multiple personalities in public. They spoke of having multiple personalities internally. And one never stopped to ask, how did they become so popular? If you take somebody, Beyonce, one of these popular ones recently, look at them as adults. Do you find something there that attracts you, that says, this is worth watching? What made them popular? There was never a chance for someone else to become popular. They were projected and made popular, put on the top of the charts, and you were made to buy because it's top of the charts. If you go back and see the pattern of television, there would be this whole series of programming for teenagers which said, what's the latest in thing? We will tell you. And so they will tell you, buy this, buy that, this is the new trend, and here's the music you should be listening to, that's the new trend. So it was a part of a massive programming effort going back at least 30 years, maybe longer, in which an entire generation was raised to cut off from their deeper sensitivities, to harden and coarsen their surface personality. And why is this important? Because what you just read was something so beautiful of the young children, the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn. There's a glow on their face. You see these children as they grow up, and I've seen such wonderful children. They enter into high school, they come under peer pressure, and suddenly something gets warped and hardened and covered up. And it's almost as if they've lost their way. And maybe 10 years down, 20 years down, something begins to reverse. And they say, you know what, we've been through this, but now we're missing something. And the whole introspection might begin to undo the damage which was done to them. And of all the good influence that you've put at home can be washed out within a couple of years through the programming, which is so powerful. It is from so many directions that it creates an echo chamber. People need to conform. And if they think this is the normal, they adjust themselves to fit into the new normal. It's an experience all of you have had. But look at what happens to a suggestible child, and if it started early on. I even don't dare speak about some of the strange perversions which are being introduced in certain states where they're taught in kindergarten that you can choose whether you're a boy or a girl. And in California, I believe there's a law that was passed that the teachers cannot, in kindergarten, cannot inform the parents if the child has decided to change gender. They're told stories of gender change and mixed relationships across multiple genders and things like that as the new normal. Now, if you do that early enough, the child comes out completely confused. I saw an example of one film actress who brought up her child as a girl. So, because, and she says in a public interview, my child at the age of 5 said, I am not a boy, so now I am raising him as a girl. Why did he say I'm not a boy? And I'm sure I have experienced this myself. When adults told me, oh, what a little boy, I said, I'm not a young boy, a little boy, I'm a grown-up guy, right? If I might have said, I'm not a boy in the sense of don't treat me like a little kid, I'm a grown-up guy, but you can misinterpret or warp it to fit into your agenda, and it can lead to enormous confusion. At a time when children are not conscious of a sexual identity, you're creating a false and even a perverse pressure for them to conform to some strange idea. And the result has been children grow up damaged by the system. We need to recognize this if we have to counter the damage. If on the other side there's this whole enormous machinery which is designed to harm the growing humanity, designed to deflect it from its deeper aspirations, intentionally. On your side, can you say, oh, I'll sit back, it's going to happen, don't worry, they're young people, they'll grow up, they'll find their way. You've done them a great disservice. On the other hand, you cannot say, I'm going to force you to be what I want. That's not going to work either. And so the challenge for you as parents and as grandparents is far greater. You have to create values and a culture at home which is literally being attacked by everything out there in the public sphere. You have to protect this, and yet you have to allow the children the freedom and the independence to make a choice. Empower their sensitivity to recognize the values of different things. I'll give an example. This is Bombay 20 years ago, maybe a little less, 15 years ago. A parent shared the story with me. Under pressure of this kind, she had raised her children with deeper values, and then the child came of age, 15, when she was under peer pressure to go to a discotheque. And the mother said, I didn't know what to do. So I said, fine, you want to go? Let's go. But I will sit on one corner, I'll have my lemon water. You can do what you like, and when you are ready to leave, let me know, we will leave together. So the mother goes with the child, she sits in her corner drinking her lemon water, and the kid moves around for a while, and then she comes to her mother and says, Mom, this space is smelly and noisy, let's get out of here. And I said to the mother, this worked because you had already raised her with sensitivity. If that sensitivity had been damaged, had been hardened, she would not have been able to make that choice. And so we really need to go far back to the earliest ages where we have to create an environment which nurtures sensitivity. And then notice the passage. I don't want to get too much into it as an educational, instructional discussion, but nurture the passage at each step, recognize what the child is needing now, and provide that kind of support. And so at an early age, especially let's say around till the age of 7 or 8 or even 9, the child is open to your example and will imitate you. That's when you can say, this is good for you, and the child will follow. And once the power of the intellect begins to kick in and the individuality begins to form, the child needs now a rational explanation. You cannot say, do this because it's good for you. You have to explain why it's good for you. And so I'm facing now children in India, in one of the second grade cities, not first tier cities also, which are far more corrupted, second tier cities. At the age of 15, children are asking teachers, why shouldn't we take drugs? The founder of Apple used to take drugs, and that was the source of his creativity. Why can't we take drugs? Alcohol, no big deal. Parents encourage children to have alcohol parties in their homes because they say, well, if we don't allow them in our homes, they're going to have alcohol anyway outside on their own. What can you do? It's almost as if your hands are tied because of the pressure from outside. And so one of the things which I suggested to the teachers, and I hope they've been working at it, was just as there's a negative peer pressure, there are a few children who do not wish to have this. Let them build their own little group where their value system is now standing up and says, we think that is infra-dig, we have a superior lifestyle and superior value system, no alcohol or drugs, and we're better than you. And allow them the boost, allow them that reverse peer pressure. Because if you don't give them the support, the other peer pressure is much stronger. The drug dealers have a strategy. They pick the smartest and good-looking children and make them the distributors. They themselves don't take the drugs. They make them the distributors. The prettiest girl is selling drugs. The smartest girl is selling drugs. What do? That becomes your reference, your norm. If a pretty girl and a smart girl is selling drugs, oh, I also become more pretty and smart. And that's the association implied. And they have a well-designed, corporate, studied strategy to push through their agenda. What do you have on your side? Well, we come and meet in these little gatherings, feel good about it and go home and hope our children will catch it. Not going to happen. You have to take an active position. You will have to initiate some engagement with your children to nourish and support them, to contain and build on the positive, sensitive and higher values that you have protected in yourself perhaps, but they have not had the occasion to build the protection for. One of those elements as they grow older will be analyzing, using their analytic power to observe themselves and influences of things on them. What happens to you when you watch this advertisement? What happens within you when you listen to this music? How does this affect you? Which do you prefer? If you do not make them introspect, they cannot make a reasonable choice. They get swayed, they get carried away. And so these are critical elements we will have to recognize as part of our responsibility. And of course, depending on the space in which you are, if you're a teacher, if you have to deal with young children, you'll have an even bigger responsibility if the numbers are larger. But at least at home, you do have this responsibility. Recognize also this is part of the declining phase of the old world dying, making a last-ditch attempt to pull down the beautiful things which are still waiting in promise, have not yet formed themselves. They're waiting in promise or making early sparks. And if you can extinguish those early sparks, you can prevent their emergence, for a while at least. Not eventually. Eventually the light will dawn. Eventually the good will overcome. But in between, how long? How dark will be the passage? Depends on us. And we have to take responsibility. We have to own our responsibility. For that, we have to recognize what are the negative trends and what they are attempting and how effectively organized they are in order to be able to counter them. And so I'm dwelling a little bit on the dark. Forgive me. It's not comfortable to face these things. It's not comfortable to recognize that you've been had, you've been tricked for decades. But if we recognize it, then we can now start the corrective measures. In the passage we read, you heard the description of worlds that fall, as of worlds that fall, a certain enormous crash. What we are seeing now is a crash not only of the economic structures, which are highly centralized, highly controlled and manipulated. The debt is higher than real money. I don't know if you're aware of this. The US dollar has been printing paper going back the last few decades. Ever since they disconnected the dollar from the gold standard, there is no physical reference to the value of money. And every time they need money, they just print more cash. But what would happen to any other country if it would do it? You would simply say inflation, and the economy would collapse. But the US economy does not collapse. Why? Because the US has ensured that it controls oil trade in the world. All oil trade in the world is in dollars. And in order to buy oil, you need dollars, and so it keeps the dollar valuable irrespective of how much is printed. When Saddam Hussein announced he was going to start trading oil in euros, that's when the US stepped in and toppled him. When the Libyan Gaddafi announced that he was going to trade oil in multiple currencies, the US bombed and removed him. And it was the only way to protect the US economy. Many of you are familiar with some of these things, but I'm pointing out to you something important, that the amount of printed cash is 6 times higher than real money. It used to be marked as M3, M2 and M1, and the US stopped publishing M3 numbers about 10 years ago almost. Why? Because if you look at those numbers, they're so humongous. What is real money? What is the real economy? We don't even know. And the banks can play you. And so it's a centralized system that plays you. The same thing is happening in politics. Both sides of both parties, if you see what they're fighting over, often they're trivial points. And both are under pay of the system. To raise money to win a campaign, you need to take money from people, and then you're indebted, you're bound to them, and all the policies are modified to suit them. If you've ever seen the television series called House of Cards, it's a first primer of how really things happen behind the scenes, worth seeing for this purpose. The same is happening inside the educational system. And I take the example of India. Children are frustrated. Every time there are examinations every year, the big exam, about 2,000 children commit suicide out of fear. They live in fear because at that moment suddenly somehow you're going to be reduced to a number and you will lose the love of your parents and the respect of your parents and society and your peer. You will become a nothing. And the parents are in high stress. In Japan, parents commit suicide when children are under stress of exams. In India, it's not yet reached that stage, but parents are frustrated. And then I speak to the bureaucrats who control the educational system, and they say, we are frustrated, we don't know what to do, we want to change it. Now, ask yourself, who can change it? The teachers are frustrated, that's the other part. They have to follow a set pattern, they know it doesn't work, it's not useful, they'd rather do something else. Everybody is frustrated, but somehow you're in a gridlock. How did that happen? What can you do to break the gridlock? Of course, you can start somewhere and in a small way. You cannot change the big system overnight. Because of the nature of entrenched systems, they protect themselves. Systems exist to survive for their own purpose. Institutions have the first priority of survival at an institutional level. The change begins with individuals. And sometimes individuals can create small schools. They'll still struggle with the system, but that's fine. But you have to begin somewhere. And that's why you will see the beginning of the new turn of consciousness is always with individuals. And individuals begin the change within them, and a few individuals move forward and create small pockets of institutions. If you go back to Europe 200 years ago, when the church controlled all education, and philosophy had questions such as, why is water wet? And the correct answer was, because it is a liquid. Oh, that was the science. The philosophy went, how many angels can dance on the tip of a needle? And there would be centuries of discussion over this. That whole education was the only education. And then there were people that said, hey, this is crazy. We need to think. We need to question. And they were considered extremists. They were considered the fringe. And then their little schools started in little pockets. Interestingly, the old schools never changed over. They just died out. The new schools replaced them. Every great transition involves the similar process. The old never lets go, they just die out. They become irrelevant and die out. The new ones start with tiny dots and then grow and become the new norm. Of course, the schools at that point took an industrial turn. We need not enter into that. But a similar passage is taking place now. I'm aware in India of so many schools which are approaching things differently. They do not have the support of the larger system. But again, even there are individuals in the larger system who are attempting. Do not worry if it is difficult. Do not worry if it seems too radical. The reference that the mother gave in the ashram and later in Auroville was this: I do not want you to repeat something which others are already doing. You have to do something which others do not even consider possible, which they cannot even imagine is possible. That's what you should be attempting. Remember, she was laying the seeds for the new world. And this is the reference all of us should have in our lives. Conformity has no value here. Of course, if you're working in a business, you have to recognize the trends within the business, and yet at every step you must be making efforts to break through to new boundaries, set new standards. And to the extent that you're able to do that within your work or in your individual life, you are participating in the emergence of the new world. And it's not just boundaries breaking for the sake of breaking. It has to represent something of the new consciousness. What aspects of it? A touch of that beauty, a touch of that harmony, a touch of its values, whatever form they may take within your space of work. An underlying sense of oneness, unity, an aspiration which lifts, a consciousness that is refined as a result of the exposure or contact to whatever you are doing. 3 words are the form in which we experience the divine in the world. In Sanskrit, Satyam, Shivam, and Sundaram. Satyam is that which is true, innately true, which stands by itself, not a relative truth, not a temporary, fashionable truth, but an innate truth which does not depend on anything else to stand for its value. Shivam, the sense of the sacred, the auspicious, that which lifts to the divine or gives you a glimpse of the divine presence. And the third, Sundaram, beautiful. And beauty is not merely a physical formal beauty, but a beauty of quality, of character, of emotion, of ambience in every way, non-formed. A beautiful heart, a beautiful thought, a beautiful feeling, a beautiful relationship, beauty in every way. And you'll see these 3 are deeply bound to each other. And these are the values that the soul finds nourishing. What's the new age about? The emergence of the spirit. What leads the emergence of the spirit? What in you responds to the spirit and recognizes it most deeply? Not your mind, not your emotions, not your senses, not your body. Your inmost sacred divine presence, your soul, your psychic being, whatever word you may choose to use. That recognizes it because that is already it in essence. And the mind could be confused, the mind could be tricked, but deep within you, that part says, yes, but somehow this feels not quite right. That feels comfortable. And you tilt and turn, navigate through the journey of life. If you have developed within yourself that deeper sensitivity and allowed its freer play, I'm not saying you have a psychic realization or you have a psychic influence which dominates your life. Just allowing that sensitivity a freer play. That's enough for you to be able to navigate through the dangers of life. Your mind might confuse, your emotions, desires might attract and confuse. But when you become quiet, you will feel deep within you this gentle nudge, suggestion that says, watch out, something is not okay here. But to be able to feel that gentle nudge and suggestion, you should be also sensitive to its gentleness. Because unlike emotions which are hard, forceful, dramatic, insistent, powerful, that is not any of these things. It never insists, it never dominates, it never asserts itself with the kind of power which you have in the vitality and the emotions of life. It puts forward a gentle suggestion, shows you, and it is obvious in its very touch. And if you don't follow it, it gently withdraws. If you follow it, it grows in strength, in clarity, in joy and fulfillment. And so each step that you take in your life, if you pause for a moment and refer to that deeper feel, however mixed it may be in the beginning, by referring to it in the stillness of your heart, with a quieted mind, you feel and then you follow. Each step that you take in following removes a fine layer of a veil, until eventually, very soon, that influence begins to stand stronger, more clear, less mixed. But each time that the influence came and gave a suggestion, and you said no, but, and you choose the opposite, you have put a veil. Because in order to say no to something that you know to be right, you have to deceive yourself. Otherwise you will feel guilty, you will know you're doing wrong. You have to justify and cover yourself by affirming a wrong, and you've put a veil. And this is what happens in the early childhood, when a child has that innate sensitivity in an ambience which is nurturing to it, and very quickly they get sucked by these peer pressures. In attempt to conform, they begin to create layers, and that's how they lose it. But you have to not only in yourself become conscious, make the child conscious of it. One of the most beautiful stories, my favorite story in fact of this example, is of a teacher in Delhi in Mirambika school who narrated this. She said she was watching two children fight, and as she was trained, she did not rush in to stop them and shout and scold. She waited and watched. And then one of the children came and sat down next to her, and she remains quiet. Now see, her state is very important. She remains quiet, and then very quietly asks the child, what happened? And it's provoking the child now to introspect. He says, I fought with my best friend. So again she's quiet, and then she says, what do you feel? Deeper introspection. He says, idhar darad hota hai. In Hindi, it's paining here. And then the teacher asks, what do you want to do? Still deeper introspection. I want to be friends with him. And then finally, very quietly, she says, what is stopping you? And the child suddenly hits bright flash of discovery and gets up, goes, makes friends, they start playing again, and they start fighting again. Okay. But you see what was just done. It could not be done if you were not in that state of quiet and internal alignment with your own divine presence. Remember, the transmission is of a resonance of truth. It's not something which is done by instruction. When you are centered, when you are aligned, and from that poise you say, what do you feel? It pulls the child inward deeper. And children are so sensitive because those layers have not hardened. I remember this was with a child who was 10 years old in my class, and she had missed my class because she had a fever. She came in the next class. She said, oh, I'm so sorry, I missed so many interesting things, but I had a fever, and I prayed and prayed for my fever to go away, but it didn't go. And she's excited and agitated. And here's a chance. If I say, well, I keep quiet, she's going to lose faith in her prayer or the value of her prayer. And I said to her, when you get agitated, when you call with that excitement, that's not the best way to feel the response. The help is there whenever you call, but you won't feel it. I said, how do I feel? I said, become very quiet. Behind this agitation, behind it, there's a part of you that's very quiet. Feel that. And then immediately she becomes quiet. And after maybe 10 seconds, there's this bright glow of joy on her face. And she says, oh, it feels so wonderful. That's it. But one had to tell her, one had to show her the way, not by instruction but by resonance, and of course the word is necessary to point out, to direct the attention. I'm giving these examples because this is your responsibility. First, to yourself, to become conscious of that presence and increasingly make it the guide in life. And second, in every contact that you have with every human being, it should be the leader of your relationship. And with those for whom you are responsible, well, you have to take steps to consciously touch, make aware, turn awareness in that direction. But from that poise within you already settled. If we don't do this, then we are giving up the field to the contrary forces. Sri Aurobindo makes a very interesting observation in respect to money. And he says, during the ascetic phase, now that goes back almost 2000 years, during the ascetic phase, humanity literally threw away money into the hands, well, they threw it away, and what happens next? The Asura seized upon it. The AntiDivine Forces seized upon it. Anti-evolutionary forces took charge, owned the wealth which was thrown away by the spiritual and aspiring part of humanity. And the same with power. You see how it is today? You will find, especially in the ascetic traditions, no, we don't want money, we don't want power, that is all corrupted. Mahatma Gandhi is an epitome, an example of this during the freedom struggle. He celebrated weakness and poverty as an ideal. Become weak, become poor, that's your greatness, that's your spirituality. And of course it's not. And there's a famous story of how an industrialist who was his follower wrote him a check of a large amount, and very dramatically he tore the check and said, I don't need your money. That example of disdain for wealth was celebrated in the ascetic tradition. But what's the truth of it? It's a perversion. The divine is Mahalakshmi, the power of plenitude, of which wealth is a part. The divine manifests in the universe with extreme plenitude and fullness and opulence, which is almost wastefully royal. You see a tree, burst of 1,000,000 flowers, living for a few days and then they die out. And again a burst of 1,000,000 flowers, wasted you might say. But it is this plenitude and splendor of fullness and an excess which is the character of the divine in manifestation. Not poverty, not lack. Poverty and lack are a perversion of the divine. And wherever the divine manifests, there has to be a growth and fullness in every way. Strength equally is a power of the divine, Mahakali. We celebrate that power, that aspect of power of the divine. And yet, you declare poverty or weakness to be divine. How can that be? It's a perversion. So I had a session in a very traditional school. It was a Vedic school, but traditionally bound in the ascetic turn. And I explained this to those students. And I said, don't you worship Mahalakshmi? They said, yes. Don't you worship Mahakali? They said, yes. That's wealth and power. And oh, yes. And for a moment, you could see there was this dichotomy within them, a conflict between two parts. And then I said, wealth is good, power is good. And their eyes grew wide. And they were struggling. And later, I elaborated on this a little bit. And I said, we have to seize back, regain. The spirit has to seize wealth and power as its own powers and not give it away in the hands of the opposition. Afterwards, an hour later, one of those students was traveling with me in the car as I was heading to the airport. And he was asking questions. He was introspecting on whatever we had discussed. And then suddenly, out of the blue, after a gap, a pause, he says, Shraddhaluji, how can we view something which is bad as good? I said, what do you mean? How can we view money as good when it is bad? He was back to that whole problem. And I said to him, do you realize what you're saying? What makes you say money is bad? And again, he was back into that conflict. And there's a large part of humanity, especially the spiritualized humanity or spiritually aspiring humanity, which is corrupted, tainted with this perversion. And it seems strange to say, but it's a perversion of spirituality. This has to be corrected, and we have to begin this in ourselves. And of course, there is a responsibility of how you deal with power and wealth. It has a corrupting influence. And even Sri Aurobindo says, the fact that the Asura has owned it for so long gives to it a certain taint. But you have to reverse that. And then he describes the guidelines for dealing with money. You do not own it, you're a trustee. And the same with power, of course. And these are things we have to develop. We saw this in India when people who came from that ascetic tradition entered politics, that they had to struggle in their relationship with both money and power. And sometimes it was not easy. Either they fell into the corruption or they remained semi-ascetic. So why did I get into this? I was drifting from our discussion. But this is part of the challenge. I come back to the original concept that deep within us, there is this divine presence. And if you give away life, abandon life, the Asura, the anti-divine forces will seize upon it. You have to equally counter it. You have to apply your own force, your own effort to take back the world, to bring it into the divine ambit. And so I'm coming to the point that you cannot remain idle and say, it will happen, it will be done. You have to be just as organized if you want to defeat that. You have to be just as persistent and forceful if you have to defeat that other. And perhaps we are not each one equipped to do that, but at least begin and extend into your current capacity to whatever degree it is. And then will come the second step. The first step, remember, was realigning with your own center. And you have to keep doing that again and again until it becomes your new center. And the second step will be now aligning with others who are similarly centered, who have similar shared values, and working in a collective effort to contain, to hold, to strengthen and amplify the divine presence and the values relating to the divine presence. And when we can form a tiny collectivity, and it need not always be that you live together in the same building or in the same community, not even sometimes in the same town. You can be across at distances, but in spirit, you maintain this collective connection. We spoke yesterday about how on a Skype call you can be connected energetically. Get onto a group call. There are tools for that today. I could push forward a brand which allows you to do that. It doesn't matter, find your own, whatever works for you. Get online, meet each other. If you don't have enough time to meet while in the same city, that's our life today, well, get online for 5 minutes and make that connection while you're in the same city. If you have a program where people can't come because they have to travel or they have something else, well, do a webcast, share it with others, let people participate online, but build that community. But the community spiritually will be only as effective as your individual foundation, your individual base grows in strength and depth. This evening, I think we have a presentation for the new center, which is now growing here in Greenville. And it's going to be one of the most beautiful centers in the world. Why? Because you know the standards set by the Rama family. Physically, it's going to be the most beautiful with the best facilities. The content there will be us. And if not next year, the year after next, we will be meeting there and not here. The content will still be us. What are we going to bring to it? And it will have to start with an individual effort, but it will have to grow into a collective. Union is too strong, but a collective network coming together, a sharing of aspiration, a joining of aspiration. And in the highest or deepest part, we may have that closeness or touch In our external parts, we will still have differences. And those differences may still involve tensions or conflicts. And that's okay. If we cling to that center, we will manage those conflicts. If we lose our center and focus on the conflict, we will not be able to resolve them. That's the nature of this transition, remember? The old methods of solving conflicts by systems and structures has failed. It is ended. Not only the economic system is collapsing, the government and authority centralized based organizations are breaking down. What is replacing them is a soul-centered collective, peer networking. You'll still have hierarchies of responsibility, but we will know each other in a soul-centered community and collectivity always. That will be the base of it. And so if we maintain our inner core and poise, whatever our external differences, we will be able to overcome them. But we cannot fix them on the basis of systems and structures alone. Systems and structures are needed, they are necessary, but they have to reflect our deeper connection and relation. I'll even put it this way, for those of you who are in business, who have teams that have to work together, every time you meet, set your center back deeper within. Instead of just starting your meeting, hey, let's get on with the agenda, let's sit in concentration for half a minute. If that's too much, 15 seconds, where you center yourself. In the New Age structures, systems of, I would use collective gatherings, they have tried to create things which in fact are quite harmful. I went to one such meeting and everybody said, let's start with a check-in. And then everyone started with describing what they are feeling, what they are thinking. And it completely destroyed the atmosphere because they rooted themselves in their ego desire center. That's not going to work, that's worsening it. Instead, root yourself in a quiet aspiration. And if you're working as a team, your first thing you do is, what are we here for? Your agenda is your means to accomplish it. What are you here for? If nothing else, to make this effort a success, to make this business or this building beautiful, effective, to serve a higher cause. That's your purpose, isn't it? And profitability is a critical part of it. Accept that also. To make it profitable and sustainable and grow beautifully in a way that lifts the consciousness of all who participate in it. That's our purpose. Align yourself to that, at the very least, if not to your deepest aspiration. And then begin your meeting. You'll find the whole nature of the interaction will change. And the same at the end, when you've finished your interaction, pause, reconnect with your aspiration before you disperse to execute the decisions made. And you'll see the culture of the corporate space will change completely. And so the second stage of the work necessary is to build these micro collectives. A third stage may happen where between collectives later you will build networks. Sri Aurobindo foresaw in the coming future, not only as you have seen this decline into darkness and a passage through it, hopefully it's short, hopefully it's not too destructive, but he foresaw subsequently the emergence of many collectives, which he described as the communities, Gnostic communities. And they would need to protect what they build, what they create, and the new consciousness that they embody, like a container, against the rest of the world which may oppose, because it's completely the opposite values. And that's fine. And that's why the strengthening is so important. We do not prematurely expand. We build the core and then let it grow organically. The work which is being initiated here, just with the appearance of the physical center, demands this psychological and spiritual completion. It's not enough to have physical facilities, and that's why our meeting here is so valuable. In a sense, subtly, unconsciously, we form a kind of a spiritual collective, however faint, however unformed, but still it's a beginning. But now this has to strengthen and coalesce, for which we go back to the first step within each one of us. In the passage we're going through now, the mother spoke of it in some pretty serious terms. I think it was 1969 that she gave the message that went men, countries, continents. The choice is imperative, truth or the abyss. There's no in between. You cannot have something which is in between, which is by definition therefore false, because it doesn't accept what is true. The other extreme is perversion, deliberate perversion. That's different from falsehood, which is mixed, distorted. But notice the formulation: men, countries, continents. First address is to humanity. Second address is to countries as collectives, national identities. And this is part of the challenge today that's ongoing. And the third was continents. What does she mean by continents to whom she's asking to make a choice? You can see it as a larger collective. You see, for example, in the United States, the NAFTA, which is the bringing together of, or the European Union, which is bringing together many different nationalities, and so on, everywhere in the world that is forming. So on each of the levels, from the individual through to the collective forms, this is the challenge. What are you going to live by? Truth or the abyss? And then later in 1972, she gave some pretty stark messages, and I'm paraphrasing them just so you have a sense of what it is. In one of them she said that if humanity does not consent to change, it will be through crashing circumstances that the change will be compelled. So you have the choice to consent. You know this needs to be done. You know these are the values you have to live by. Well, if you don't, crashing circumstances will compel it. You saw, maybe 10 years ago, in the economic crisis in the US, the whole thing was the result of fakery at the top levels. They had tried to fool people, fool themselves until the whole thing collapsed, like a house of cards. The situation demanded a change in the system. What was done instead? They just printed cash, put it back into the system, and rebooted. That's it. You will have another crash for sure. It's a question of time, unless you change the system. So by compulsion of crashing circumstances, well, it will happen. But the change can be done gradually. You don't have to break it to make a new one. It can be made gradually, but it has to begin. There's another message she gave. She said, I hope that humanity will not have to pass through one of those dark nights of civilization. We have had such passages in the past before. A night of civilization where the darkness becomes so suffocating. And at best there are points of light which push through and survive, and after that there's a rebuilding eventually. I hope, she says, we do not have to pass through one of those. What you see though in the trend of decline, which I just spoke about briefly and very superficially, we are heading for that, for sure. If we begin a corrective process now, it will still take us a couple of decades to rebuild. The poisoning of the environment, for example, has gone so far that the poisons in the seawater and in the drinking water and in the aquifers has reached a degree that if you start reversing the process, it will take you 200 years to get the poisons out. Okay, so do we start or do we wait? We should start right now. And then there is this whole old world, which the entrenched interests, which make sure you will not start by deflecting your attention to what? Global warming, climate change, carbon dioxide, which is not a poison. And yes, of course, you're messing up Earth's balance, but Earth can rebalance herself. When carbon dioxide goes up too much, then the oceans absorb carbon dioxide. So all the projections made 20 years ago have failed because the oceans absorbed most of the carbon dioxide. Projections made 10 years ago have failed. Earth has her own way of balancing because carbon dioxide is not a poison. But mercury is a neurotoxin. Cadmium is a poison. Lead is a poison which creates dullness in the brain, not only other diseases, but actually drops the IQ. For decades, they introduced lead in petrol, and the IQ of people dropped. And lead accumulates in the nervous system. And so you have a whole set of neurological problems. When they removed lead in countries, IQ went up within a few years, at least 5 points, average IQ. Can you believe it if you were told before, I'm going to make your internal combustion engine more efficient, but your children will become more stupid? Will you accept? I'm going to give you food that tastes so great that you'll blow your mind, but you'll have cancer after 10 years. Will you accept? Well, they don't tell you. I just saw a few years ago, 2 years ago maybe, in India, the headlines on a newspaper that said, cancer rates in India have shot up 40%. And then the subtitle said, it's the hereditary form of Indian people. The cause is hereditary. Can you believe the stupidity and falsehood so blatantly put before you? And half the people reading will believe it and repeat it. Because you've been programmed to accept, to trust. The evidence is the very contrary. In 10 years it's shot up. Why? Because in the last 10 years, pre-packaged foods have shot up in sales. People are no more cooking at home, they're buying things from outside, which have huge components of preservatives and poisons of all kinds. That's your cause, but you don't want them to know the real cause. You go back 40 years, 1970s, the evidence of all clinical trials was that the cause of heart disease was sugar. And the sugar industry paid the researchers to shift the blame to butter and fat. And then it became part of the public education program that said, cut down on your fat because that's going to cause you heart problems. Whereas the sustained evidence was it was sugar and not fat. And today you can see they're telling you fat is good for you. You need it for your good heart, right? And you should know that there's a whole industry which is out there to deflect your attention from the poisoning of life to carbon dioxide and warming or cooling or whatever it is. You don't even want to get into the argument. Because it does not matter. Sea levels rising 1 meter or not. It's all projections. It does not matter. Life will end in a single generation if you do not stop the poisoning of the environment. That's what we should be talking about. And stopping today. Can you do it? It's not in your hands. The machinery owns and controls your lifestyle. So start with a pushback, but start. And so I'm coming back to this. First point, there is a massive decline in degeneration. And if you do nothing, it will destroy. It is completely contrary to the emergence of the new consciousness and the new world and all of our aspirations and spirit. But that will push back. And it will push back on its own with or without you. It will take time. But you have a choice to participate in that pushback consciously, and then it can happen rapidly. We don't need to pass through the nights of darkness. We'll still face the consequences of the damage done, but we can minimize them. And that will start with each one of us individually, second step collectively, and third step networking across collectives. And I would like each one of you who have come to this gathering to go back with this clear, firm decision to consciously dedicate your life to this purpose. This dedication does not conflict with anything else you are doing. It fills everything you are doing and lifts everything you are doing to a higher Godward possibility. I'll pause here and invite your comments or questions.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So, in the corporate world, especially in the US, I've lost touch with the Indian corporate, but in the US especially, what we see is there's this spiritual, the leaders of the corporate world have vitality, almost to a vulgar level of vitality, and then there's people who have spirituality, but then lack vitality. Now, how do we help bridge the gap? And when we go into the corporate world, we see the leaders are extremely high level of egoistic vitality. And here I am trying to make sense out of it and push myself through it.
Yes.
How do you help us?
Okay, very important question. The role of vitality, which you see in corporate world, and the lack of it in the spiritual domain. Vitality is critical for any physical manifestation. You need the energy and the drive to bring it all the way into matter. The problem of vitality is it's also the domain of desire and impulsiveness of desire. So especially people who have a strong vitality are always struggling with their own impulsiveness and their desire nature. What you need is a refined and trained vitality led by a higher mind or even spiritual inspiration. Then the vitality becomes an excellent servant and the most effective for manifestation in matter. An untrained vital can make you a mixed instrument. Occasionally you have bursts of good and then distortions which come with it. The problem is, this is part of that what we discussed earlier, the asura seizing power. The vital energy and the power which comes with the vital was given away, which was abandoned by the spiritual, because they said, if you want spiritual life, you should give up all the enjoyments of the world. And those with strong vital find it very difficult. And yet the greatest spiritual leaders have been those who had a great vitality. The Buddha is a great example. What a royal vitality and strength, and he built a massive impact on the world, not only with the power of the spirit, but the transmitting power of the vital. And this is the case everywhere. But the challenge is the purification and organization and training of the vital, and it is required for all of us. Not all of us start with a strong vital. But by a spiritual process, by an opening of the vital to a higher consciousness and the widening of the vital, we can build and strengthen the vitality. So there are two paths. One is you take birth with a strong vital, which is not so regenerate, and then you struggle to organize and purify it to make it a good instrument. Or you start with a relatively weak vitality, a strong sattvic temperament, and then you develop your vitality under constant influence of the sattvic character. Sometimes an individual's vitality being weak can be compensated by collective vitality. The four of us together, each one alone is ineffective, but when we are four together, our energies combine. And that is effective. I have seen in India, without naming things, a person who is head of a very popular socio-spiritual movement, and he never enters a hall alone. If he has a public program, he will be followed with a retinue of 20 people because his personal vitality is very weak. The vitality of his group is what comes with him and catches. But then, because his vitality is weak, he is also slave to the group demand of those who control him, who have put a corporate plan in which effectively he is a pawn that they have to use to build their movement. So somewhere along the way, you may start with these means, but you have to develop the fullness, both of the power of your intellect and of your vitality, and for it a strong physical base. You can't have a strong vitality with a weak physical body. And all this makes you the most effective instrument for the spirit. But let's say wherever you are, you start and develop as far as you can go. The spirit has the power to lift your vitality and build it, lift even your physical health and rebuild it. There is this statement Sri Aurobindo quotes, which is, I think, from Adi Shankaracharya. He says this: the power of the spirit makes for the lame to climb mountains. Yes.
I just wanted to comment. I think that there are two of the largest movements that have happened probably the last 40 years in the United States that are extremely distressing are obviously all the media, all the internet, where these kids think they're forming relationships. They don't learn how to make friends.
Yes.
They trust people, they don't even know why, which is what you were saying about all of the manipulation. The second thing that concerns me is the loss of the community hero, so to speak, because when we were growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, you can look up to, whatever, Carl Yastrzemski. You can look up to an athlete, look up to an actor, appreciate their talent. That's fine. These are not your role models.
No.
You don't need to know what they're like in public. You don't want to know what they're like. They have a talent. But the people that you need to emulate are, if it's in your family, if it's in your faith, in your community, these are people you can watch and follow. And I think that's where it really starts, so that our kids can build that base, and that is that then as they go off into every profession is so difficult now that there isn't, you have to surround yourself, like you were saying, with a group that is like-minded, and that's where you get your strength.
Absolutely.
And I think it's happening. It's happening because these kids are getting sick and tired of being told, we'll buy this today, we'll know you're an idiot. Wait a minute, now we've got Facebook spying on everything you're doing and lying, and everybody knows this personal stuff.
Yes.
I do think it's starting.
So I want to touch upon this very important point you raised about community which were existent and which have got fragmented, family which existed and has got fragmented. Go back to the 50s and 60s in America. One person of the family would earn the living enough to sustain the entire family with at least 2 or 3 children. What happened over time? The squeeze was put upon you by the banking system, playing with loans and making you dependent in a way that now both parents have to work hard and you still can barely support one child. And this family is so divided now, the child comes home to an empty house. Where does he get the culture? Television and peer pressure. Where earlier you came home to a warm, embracing family. And the fact that there was someone always in the house became the networking point for the local community. Today, no one is there at home. Where is the community? You come home, you're so tired, you don't have time to engage with others. At best, you have a few superficial social engagements. And so, these are all part of our overall strategy designed to fragment society and turn us into individual illusion of freedom, but slaves.
Slaves, exactly. And,
Yes.
and also in the 60s and 70s, when the women's movement, which was phenomenal and was way overdue, being educated, getting the equal opportunities, that was all fantastic, except for the fact that staying at home, being a mother was totally devalued. That's also starting to change, where the young professional women now are thinking, that's garbage.
Yes.
I can't have it all. I can stay home and I'm not judged because I have a PhD or an MD or whatever.
That's right.
And I'm going to
It's changing, but too slow for the time we have. And the second point which you made, which is also important, who are the role models? And if you see, the media today projects film stars as your role models. And if film stars tell you this is good or that is bad, you're supposed to somehow believe it because they are more intelligent, more capable, more experienced. Do they have anything to show other than their acting in cinema? Nothing. In fact, they have some of the most perverse lives. And yet they are projected as your icons. And so that is a very powerful influence which is used to distort values for children. Yes.
I think our salvation are the young people. My granddaughter just graduated from the University of Atlanta, and most of the honors were going to young children with biology, and a lot of them were from India. Quite a few. So you should be happy about that. And I sat together with the kids later on, and right now they talked a lot about what happened in Parkland, that all these young people got together, the whole country was behind them. They were all young people, and these are the people our hope. These are the kids our hope. We have to help them, we have to be there for them, and of course I talked to one young man from India. Well, he's going home, he's not staying in this country. So whatever he learned in his biology, India's going to benefit from it. And that's the problem, that we do not keep people here anymore. They come to school, they're terrific school students, they go back to their own countries because the way we feel about S countries.
Yes. And in India we complain that our best students go to the US and settle there. We don't.
Can I just say something?
Yes.
I'm not talking too much. To add on to that lady's point, she's exactly right. And those Parkland kids, they were off, once they started their movement, there were many of the well-known people who jump on every cause that wanted to get behind them, and they said no, which was amazing.
Yes.
These kids are amazing.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I want to end with another passage from Savitri. Keep in mind, we were speaking of the transition of an age, a declining phase, and you have to distinguish what you have to let go and not attached to. And the building phase, where you have to recognize what are the centers of light and the values which you have to catch, nourish and strengthen. Okay? But in between is the squeeze, when the darkness. When darkness deepens, strangling the earth's breast, and man's corporeal mind is the only lamp. Corporeal mind, that's your little thinking surface, physical mind that says, what I see is all I know. When the darkness deepens so much that you can't believe anything, you can't trust anything, not even your physical mind. As a thief in the night shall be the covert tread of one who steps unseen into his house. One who steps unseen into his house, covert tread of a thief in the night. So you have the night all around. Who is this one? A voice, capital V. A voice ill-heard shall speak, the soul obey. A power into mind's inner chamber steal. A charm and sweetness open life's closed doors, and beauty conquer the resisting world. What's this influence he's talking about? You see, the soul obey. The soul here is the surface soul, not the inner soul. And the power stealing in is, who is the true owner of your house, of your mind, body, life? Your soul, the divine presence. And that has so far been kept out of the house, and it enters and takes charge. And it commands, and the surface person, individual soul, obeys. Into mind's inner chamber, not the surface chamber, on the inside, the light comes, awakes something, turns your thoughts in a certain way. And the life's closed doors, which are all your senses looking out, which have shrunk back in distrust, they open because of the charm and sweetness. The coarseness and crudeness is as if removed and healed. And beauty conquer the resisting world. And he continues. The truth light capture nature by surprise. A stealth of God compel the heart to bliss, and earth grow unexpectedly divine. And then the promise after that. In matter shall be lit the Spirit's glow, in body and body kindled the sacred birth, the birth of the divine presence within us. Night shall awake to the anthem of the stars. The days become a happy pilgrim march. Our will, a force of the Eternal's power, and thought, the rays of a spiritual sun. And when this emerges, when this presence and the new dawn takes over, a few shall see what none yet understands. God shall grow up while the wise men talk and sleep. For man shall not know the coming till its hour, and belief shall be not till the work is done. And this is a glimpse of this passage, but it points to the saving grace, which is the divine presence within us, asserting itself, coming forward, taking charge and compelling our darkened or confused nature to a light and truth. If you look back at the last 2000 years, almost all of the great religions have foreseen some great transition. So great they didn't know how to describe it. In the biblical tradition, there is this whole fire and brimstone and a passage through great difficulty. And then after that, the kingdom of God. God raises all into his own light, which is again misunderstood or distorted by the church interpretation of it, taking certain things literally, not recognizing their symbolic or deeper spiritual truth. In the Sufi tradition, similarly, there is the concept, or with the Christian tradition, with it the second coming, which is the coming of the divine into his own. In the Sufi tradition, similarly, there is this idea that after all that has happened, a great Sufi saint said, 1,000 years from now, he said that 1,000 years ago. So 1,000 years from now, when man steps on the moon, Islam will rise to its highest and then fade away. And that will be the time of the Imam Mahdi, the one who will bring the light and establish the truth. You'll find in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you have the Dalai Lama who incarnates to lead the people both spiritually and politically. And there's an ancient prophecy that says the 14th Dalai Lama will be the last. Interesting. And you wonder why. And the present Dalai Lama was asked, is it true? And he became very quiet for a while, and then he said, it's possible. And you know what has happened, China taking over many parts of Tibet, and the whole framework of the Dalai Lama's place as a political leader has changed completely. It has lost relevance, and it's to be seen. But the idea of a radical change. In the Christian mystical tradition, there's another prophecy which comes from one of the very old popes 500 years ago, who was a visionary, who was a mystic. He foresaw the coming of, I think, 103 popes after him, describing each one in symbolic terms. And in his sequence, he said, the current pope will be the last. There will be no other. In Nostradamus' prophecies, similarly, there's some sense of great transitions and changes. I'm not going into details because they don't matter. They were attempts by mystics to see far off into the future of the nature of a change which was inconceivable to the mind. And so they described it symbolically. What matters is we are in the thick of that change today. In the Indian tradition, it's the transition of one yuga into the next. Sri Aurobindo puts it in psychological terms. The age of reason ends. The spiritual age, before it can begin, there is the subjective age and the passage in between, in which there is the false subjectivism of your ego and desire and the true subjectivism of the soul. And this is where we are at, and this is the choice that we have to make. And all those, as if prepared for this transition which we are living today. So we are in the most precious, the most important, the most interesting times, spiritually also the most opportune, where Sri Aurobindo says, a little effort produces great results and changes destiny, compared to other times when much labor goes to the making of a little result. And so every day matters, every step matters, every little effort matters and can make a huge difference. Let us meditate on this briefly before we disperse for lunch.